Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Mark Hughes, and I'm the founding faculty director of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy here at the Weitzman School of Design, led by our beloved Dean, Fritz Steiner. We also have the pleasure of having a second dean in the house for this event today, Dean Andrew Hoffman from the Vet School, that we're doing some very interesting collaboration with on the food energy nexus. It's my privilege to work with the center's amazing team, led by Corey Collane, and including Bill Cohen, Kim Sorowski, Angela Pichon, Lindsay Samahan, Molly Simon, Oscar Serpell, and Andy Stone, all of whom have worked so hard to produce the 7th annual Carnot Prize. It takes so much behind the scenes. I do none of that work, and these colleagues do a fabulous job with it. So I would like to ask for a round of applause. And none of this hard work would be possible without the extraordinary generosity and ingenuity of our founding patron, Scott Kleinman. His active investor management of the center has been such a guiding blessing throughout these 8 years of work together. From the very beginning, Scott has defined the vision that represents our mission and our work since it was not an initial effort, it is an ongoing one, and his engagement is so valuable to the center's staff, to our faculty colleagues, and perhaps most importantly, because it happens in so many ways, our students. He's an inspiration, he's a resource, he's an example. So thank you, Scott. And that vision has attracted the partnership and guidance of our wonderful advisory board, many of whom are with us here today: Paul Bonney, Mark Brownstein, Sonny Popowski, Ken Kulak, and others. I'm so grateful to all of these people who together account for why I've stayed in this job many years longer than any other job I've ever had. I think that's a thank you, but it has been a real pleasure. Now, I'd be remiss with all of the Benjamin Franklin, Ken Burns frenzy of this month to not talk about, briefly, our founder and how Ben Franklin represents so many things. But in this room, he represents Penn's first energy scholar. He discovered electricity, or at least its most fundamental characteristic, polarity, that accounts for its flow that we use every day. He invented the lightning rod, and he organized fire protection and insurance. So science, technology, and policy, Penn integrates knowledge for the advancement of good. Ben Franklin was Penn's first energy scholar, and that is a standard that we try to live up to. Now, those beautiful banners outside in the staircase, which took a little rogue guerrilla activity on our part to get hung on the first time. So glad we did. Possession is 9/10 of the law. They look fantastic, and they represent a truly distinguished role at this stage of Carnot Prize recipients and remind us of some of our very best, happiest days at the center. And today, we certainly extend that distinguished tradition. We are delighted to have brilliant Penn colleagues joining us here today, who are far better fitted than I to the task of fittingly celebrating this year's distinguished recipient. Let me only say that Nicholas Stern maintains my hypothesis that the smarter they are, the more modest they are, And the more gracious they are, the more effective they are, because those are the qualities, all four, that define Nicholas Stern. Now, for more substantive remarks, it's my privilege to introduce Francis X. Diebold to offer this year's faculty lecture in tribute to our recipient. Frank is the Paul F. Miller Jr. and E. Warren Schaefer Miller Professor of the Social Sciences and Professor of Economics, Finance, and Statistics at the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on the predictive modeling of financial asset markets, macroeconomic fundamentals, climate change, and their interface. He has made well-known contributions to the measurement and modeling of asset return volatility, business cycles, yield curves, and network connectedness, and is regularly ranked among globally most cited economists. Frank.
Sorry, it flipped. All right. So I'll go for about 25 minutes, I'm told. We can do that. I'm feeling good. Those large American sandwiches that were mentioned at lunch put me into sort of a slumbering mood about an hour ago, but now I've got the adrenaline and I'm ready to roll. So it's feeling good. It's a great honor for me to help honor Lord Stern. This sort of just arrived one day in the email a few months ago, and it was just an amazing windfall. I said, sure, I'd be delighted to do it. So there's so many different directions that one can take. I, of course, am sort of supposed to be not necessarily the dour, economist, but, a little bit more of a serious talk, with some equations and things like that. And then, Olivia is gonna elevate things to a more sort of prize-winning sort of feel. But I would like to offer a few remarks. And as you can see, I've called them a review of reviews of the Stern Review, which I think resonates with me and hopefully with many of you, but I understand that all of the backgrounds, or many of the backgrounds, are very different in here. Some of you are climate scientists, some of you are economists, others of you are all different things. So I want to sort of step back and explain a few things. If you Google the Stern Review, which of course came out almost 20 years ago, I think it was 2006, all sorts of things come up, pictures of the book, pictures of the Lord himself, all sorts of scary arrows that get more and more red as you go to the right, different cartoons. You probably can't see this, but this one's actually pretty funny. It's a picture of Lord Stern carrying the Stern Review, which was like thousands of pages. And in the background are all the dead trees, from the paper used to print that. So anyway, I mean, this is a big deal. Just Googling it, of all things. So let me get a little bit more serious and sort of set the stage. And I want to focus in on one particular thing. There's lots of things we could talk about, but I want to talk about the discount rate, more particularly the subjective rate of time preference and what that's all about and how it featured in Lord Stern's thinking and what's happened to professional thinking about that discount rate in the subsequent years. So the basic background, though, of course, is consumption's going up, consumption, output, GDP, however you want to think about it. Oh, one great thing, the best thing, or second, the best thing is giving the lecture. The second best thing is that they told me I could take my mask off. So let me do that. So, consumption, output, et cetera, economic activity, of course, is growing, and that makes emissions, which make the temperature go up, but then that feeds back and causes damages, of course, and you can think of that as, making consumption go down, so there's sort of a tension there. And the Stern Review many years ago now, was very forceful in saying that, inaction will have disastrous consequences. Decisive action is needed now. And again, this was the early 2000s. And that met with a lot of resistance. Not universal resistance, but there was a lot of resistance. Partly the resistance was people sort of saying, well, the Stern Review underestimates costs of mitigation and overestimates benefits. There's a lot of stuff we could talk about there. It's not clear that that's true at all. But actually, that's not what I want to talk about today. Arguably, the biggest criticism of the Stern Review had to do with the discount rate. The point being that the benefits of mitigation occur later, often much, much, much later, and the costs occur now. Okay, so depending on how you discount the future, a lot of different answers can arise. Okay, and it turns out that in the Stern Review, of course, I've just got 20 minutes, so we're not going into all the details, but it turns out that in the calculations underlying the Stern Review, a very low discount rate, well, it's going to turn out, I think, I'm going to argue that it's not very low, but what was thought by many to be a very low discount rate, very close to zero, was used. And people said, well, sure, okay, then you're basically not discounting the future, okay? If that's the case, then even little gains way off still count a lot, even now. And, but that's sort of not right. So let's back up and sort of look in a little more closely. Okay, so I said there's going to be some equations, no big deal, but there's just like one slide or two where we've got to lay out some precise sorts of things. So economists like to talk about the consumption, of course, which generates some utility. So this is utility of consumption. At any point in time, the economy is producing output. You can think of it as consumption goods, and that generates some utility. And we might want to add up the stream of utilities over the future, but we might want to discount them. So this discount rate delta here is the so-called subjective rate of time preference. And this is very important to distinguish from a market interest rate. When you're talking about utilities and discounting utilities, it's a subjective sort of things. How do I, or how does Lord Stern think about, trading off now for later in utility terms? That's very different from the market interest rate in general, from asking, if I put $1 in the bank today, what will it be worth in 10 years? Or conversely, $1 in 10 years, what's that discounted back to the present? That's kind of a market interest rate sort of thing. But when we're talking about utility, it's a subjective rate of time preference. All right, and usually people use so-called constant relative risk aversion utility functions, and the risk aversion there is eta. And, but it's basically a discounted utility situation with the subjective rate of time preference being the discount rate. Now, a long time ago, like in the 1920s, Frank Ramsey worked out a relationship between the subjective rate of time preference delta and the market interest rate R in an aggregative macro, representative agent type environment. They're not the same in general. This is a long run sort of equilibrium relationship. Even in long run equilibrium, the market interest rate R is not the same as the subjective rate of time preference delta. The wedge is this risk aversion times the per capita growth rate. And risk aversion is, we tend to think people are risk averse. Maybe it's 1 or 2 or 5, but it's not 0, this eta. And per capita growth is, 1%, 2%, 2.5% historically. So you have this sort of relationship here. So you can see that the subjective rate of time preference is, in fact, as long as this is positive, less than the market interest rate. we'll come back to that. So this is just some sort of background, discounted utility. We discount with the subjective rate of time preference, and the Ramsey relationship relates the subjective rate of time preference to what you might normally or more normally want to discount with, namely a market interest rate. All right. So, depending on who you are, maybe you're thinking, my God, this is ridiculously mathematical. Maybe you're thinking, my God, this is childish. Why doesn't he do something more complicated? Probably somewhere in between. It's really not childish. But it's important that we lay out that one slide. But now let's think about the discount rate, the subjective rate of time preference. That's the big deal. In the Stern review, it was basically assumed to be close to zero, and a lot of people had a lot of problems with that. So let's think about that. In the Stern review, the motivating thought for doing that, for assuming such a low discount rate, was what you might call, utilitarian philosophical thinking. Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, people like that, kind of early to mid 19th century British philosophical thinking. It sounds so trite when you boil it down to like one little sentence on a slide or something, but there's a lot of thought behind this. And the idea, though, is that in utility terms, everyone should be treated equally. The fact that someone's further in the future doesn't mean he or she is less valuable or less important or less deserving of good conditions any more than someone in California versus someone in Pennsylvania at a point in time, should be favored or disfavored. So just treat everyone equally. That's sort of the utilitarian perspective. You can go much further. Go to Rawls. The Rawlsian perspective is to maximize the welfare of the worst off person in society. People like Nordhaus, who I love, who everyone loves. I mean, he's done amazing things. But people like Nordhaus sort of would say, well, the poorest generation is the current one because we're growing. But that's not clear, is it? I mean, the whole point is that with the sorts of climate change that may well happen, the future generations could actually be worse off than the present generation. We mentioned tipping points and so on at lunch. So at any rate, the utilitarian perspective suggests a near zero subjective rate of time preference. The Rawlsian perspective, I think, when you give it a generalized and more thorough interpretation, suggests a potentially near zero subjective rate of time preference. Let's get a little more mathematical now. Go back to Ramsey. Here's the Ramsey relationship. Ramsey's a theorist, so theorists like to just plug in numbers and get crude approximations to things. So here's the Ramsey relationship. You can rewrite it like that. So the subjective rate of time preference is the market interest rate adjusted by this product of risk aversion and per capita growth rates. Well, if this, of course, R here is a real interest rate. Suppose we put in, 2% for the real interest rate, maybe 1 for relative risk aversion, a per capita real growth rate of 2%, it takes you to delta equals 0. Exactly the Stern sort of prescription. This is what I might call macro theoretical. You can talk about macro empirical as well. It happens that Glenn Rudebush is sitting here. He's visiting us this week. So I think of this as Ramsey, Bauer, Rudebush, same thing, but rather than just plugging in, some reasonable number like 2% for the real interest rate, we can make use of what Glenn and his co-author have done in a beautiful paper that's actually coming out in the Review of Economics and Statistics, like right now, or maybe it's already out. But at any rate, they've used very sophisticated techniques to estimate the trend of the underlying interest rate. And it's kind of a random walk sort of thing. So your best guess of where it's going to be at any future time is where it is now. And they have produced the most sophisticated estimates of of where it is now, and it's at about 1/2 of 1%. My God, you plug that into the Ramsey relationship and you get a subjective rate of time preference of -1.5%. Okay, I don't want to go there. Okay, I'm not going to argue for a negative discount rate. Maybe I should. Maybe somebody wants to. But you can see it's all delta is 0. Delta is 0. Maybe delta is even negative. Okay, and it continues. You might say, well, Ramsey, Rudebush, Bauer are all kind of aggregative, representative agent, macroeconomic kind of perspective. But in reality, there are all sorts of different people and they're tremendously heterogeneous. And my subjective rate of time preference might be very different from Olivia's. And so what do we do in a situation like that? Well, in an amazing paper in Econometrica, a very leading economic journal, just recently, some people did an amazing piece of analysis. They just wrote down some conditions that I think most people would reasonably want a social welfare function to satisfy. It discounts exponentially. That's how all the discounting always works, like all the stuff we've already looked at. It's Pareto in the sense that the social planner would never do anything that everyone dislikes. You don't take a move that makes everybody worse off. That's just silly. So the planner doesn't do that. And it's non-dictatorial in that the planner pays attention to everyone, sort of listens to everyone's preferences, may take certain actions and not take other actions, but it's not a dictator just ignoring the population. So if you have these three conditions, it turns out that they're equivalent to, it's an if and only if kind of thing. The social welfare functions delta, in other words, the subjective rate of time preference delta, is no greater than that of the most patient member of society. And the most, we've got this massive society, all sorts of people with all sorts of discount rates. The most patient person is basically going to have a discount rate of 0, or just, epsilon away from 0. There's somebody out there among billions of people who's very, very, very patient. So again, delta equals 0. So no matter how what you do, you get to it. Marty Weitzman, the famous Weitzman so-called gamma discounting, works like this. What he showed is that if you've got heterogeneous people, some patient, some less patient, some very impatient, what that implies for the discount function of a social planner is that the discount rate as you go farther and farther out should be dropping. So it's kind of like the discount function is dropping more slowly, actually, than exponential decay, like a gamma distribution, of which exponential is a special case, but gamma can decay more slowly. So again, small subjective rates of time preference near 0. So interestingly, and this is the point is simply that in the nearly 20 years since the Stern Review, which was criticized, fairly harshly for, pulling out of thin air some subjective rate of time preference near 0. In the intervening years, all of the best thinking from a variety of perspectives has arrived at the view that the subjective rate of time, the appropriate subjective rate of time preference should be about 0. Quite interesting. You could think of that as sort of flattening the Nordhaus policy ramp. This is just meant to be completely suggestive and not drawn to scale, whatever that might mean. But, the idea is that, Nordhaus sort of says, well, we don't want to take too much action too soon, but later on we'll do it. I'm always reminded, it's like the prayer of St. Augustine, right? Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. It's that kind of thing. And Weitzman and others come along and kind of flatten the policy ramp some. More action now. And Stern, Ramsey, Bauer, Rudebush, Feng-Key, all the things I just mentioned, kind of flatten it some more. So you can think of professional thinking as moving toward a flatter policy ramp, and that's very much linked toward that thinking moving toward lower subjective rates of time preference, very close to 0. Well, so the Stern Review said, the situation is serious. We need to take significant action, and we need to take that action now. This is back in the early 2000s. Again, there was criticism, but if anything, the criticism looks just moot from the point of view of modern research. Low discount rates make sense. In the remaining 5 minutes or whatever, I just want to show you what's been. I'm going to switch gears a bit and show you some vignettes of what's been happening lately in a particular area that I know a bit about, namely Arctic sea ice. The news is not good, of course, because to an important extent, the appropriate action was not and has not been taken. Some actions have been taken and some successes have happened, and it's not all gloom and doom. But I want to show you some aspects of what's been happening and what will happen in the coming decade or two in terms of Arctic sea ice. In work with Glenn, actually, and some other co-authors, we've been modeling Arctic sea ice as a function of carbon emissions, whether measured in gigatons of carbon or in CO2 concentrate or atmospheric concentrations, and we've been doing that in various ways. Here's a picture representing a modeling. You can see how tight the relationship is between Arctic sea ice measured as area here, just area in square kilometers, or thickness, which is another aspect of sea ice, here in red. The shaded region is the future. We are standing right here, right now. And you can see what's, when thickness goes to zero, area must be zero too. They've got to hit zero at the same time. So we can impose that. And you can see that it turns out they hit zero at about 920 gigatons of carbon. It's actually 921, I happen to know. There it is. And what you can do is take that 921 gigatons of carbon and run it through the inverse of one of the IPCC emissions scenarios. So this is kind of a business as usual middle ground scenario, the 7.0 scenario. And you run that 921 gigatons through it and see when that happens. It's about 2040. And that's for a totally ice-free Arctic. That's not even, the Arctic doesn't have to be ice-free. There might be a few ice cubes floating around and, things like that. Nobody cares about that. More seriously, what happens when the ice melts is you have so-called land-fast or shore-fast ice that clings to shores and the perimeters of islands and things like that. But that's just a little bit, the basic sea is open. So people often don't worry about a 0 square kilometers of area, but rather a million square kilometers. So this would be a million. You go over that and you see, well, I'll show you what it is actually in just a second. So anyway, if we convert from carbon relationship to a time relationship, there it is. We're achieving 0 Arctic sea ice in about 2040, just a year or two after 2040. But again, that's 0. We're achieving a near ice-free Arctic much earlier. How much earlier? Well, here are the numbers. You can simulate this and see. And you can see them in the business as usual scenario, the 7.0 scenario, the median timing of a nearly ice-free Arctic is 2031. It's less than a decade away. You use a more successful mitigation scenario, a lower emissions scenario, 4.5. Of course, it delays the arrival of a near ice-free Arctic, but only by a bit. Now, this is just the median. What if you say, okay, but I want to be much more sure. Maybe I want to go out to 80 or 95%. Still, it goes up some, but it's in the 2030s at any rate, no matter what you do, with very, very, very high confidence. So, you know, we should have taken action. We didn't take action. We're paying the consequences. We'll continue to pay the consequences if we don't take action now. What are some of the consequences? There's a very special thing, but the Arctic is very special and very important. The tipping points were raised by Lord Stern at lunch today. And moreover, the Arctic is warming at, it depends who you listen to, but let's say at 3 or 4 times the speed of the rest of the planet due to the feedback effects. When ice melts, ice tends to be white, which reflects heat, but when it melts, it turns into open sea, which is black, which absorbs heat. And then, so it feeds back on itself, you know. So when you look at the Arctic today, in certain respects, it's like seeing the rest of the planet, you know, in 30 or 40 years. So that's why it gets so much, or one of the reasons why it gets so much attention. So you know, the news isn't good, but you know, but it's never too late. You know, there are a lot of success stories. I think the private market is coming to the rescue in certain ways that I wouldn't have really imagined some time ago, with technological innovation to satisfy consumer demands, you know, by firms, by profit maximizing firms is actually turning out to be successful. And, you know, I don't want to give a gloom and doom story, but at the same time, I think it's very clear that the warning was sounded. We sort of missed it. We're paying the price. And the reason, or the foundation on which the warning was sounded, most of which, or much of which, was low subjective rates of time preferences, actually makes sense. And that idea is much, much less controversial now than it was back in 2000 or 2006. So with that, I'll turn it over. And again, let me just say what a wonderful honor it is to just offer my personal thoughts about some of the evolution of these ideas and what they've meant for us. So it was a pleasure. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.
And thank you, Frank, for reminding me that I am also allowed to take off. I shaved for the first time in about a month for just this occasion, so I don't want that wasted underneath my mask. Thank you. I mean, Frank, for that kind of remarkable accounting of just one of the legacy insights and impacts of the Stern Report, among dozens of incisive and frankly courageous positions that were taken so early on in the report. Now it's time for our recipient to do some receiving. And we're very fortunate to have a presenter of the prize whose commitment to the future through her own career and work is equal to that of our guest. Olivia S. Mitchell is the International Foundation of Employee Benefits Plans professor and professor of insurance and risk management and business economics and public policy at the University of Pennsylvania. Olivia's research interests include the economics of public and private pensions. All of these topics grow more and more interesting to me. Financial literacy and public finance. She's made major contributions to the understanding of how systematic longevity risk and financial crises can shape household portfolios and work patterns over the life cycle. The economics of finance has defined contribution pensions, financial literacy, and wealth accumulation, and claiming behavior for Social Security benefits. She is herself the recipient of many awards, including 2 in the same year from the same organization, naming her simultaneously among the top 25 most influential people in the world and the top 50 women in wealth, which suggests to me that men lower the value of any group they're a part of. Olivia, thank you for what you are about to do for us.
Thank you. Well, it's a very, very great honor and pleasure to be here with you today. Colleagues, benefactors, visitors, ladies and gentlemen, it's terrific to be here with you to present the 2022 Carnot Prize from the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. This is being awarded to the 7th recipient and first academic to win the University of Pennsylvania's highest energy honor. Our awardee is, as you know, professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science, the author of the groundbreaking Stern Review on the Economics of Climate Change, and among many other past activities, former chief economist and senior vice president of the World Bank. In 2004, he was knighted for services to economics, and he's held numerous positions at top universities and other institutions around the world. I wrote to him before he came and said, is there anything you would especially like me to mention? And he said, yes. He said, mention that I came to my work on energy and climate, having devoted much of my professional life to the promotion of economic development and the study of public policy, both in academia and in multilateral institutions. Indeed, he sees this link as central to the challenge of sustainable and resilient development, as do I. Professor Stern is a stellar leader, speaking out untiringly on the now already evident effects of global warming and the imperative need for a transition to a low carbon economy. He offers a positive view of what can be done, both to support growth and to save the planet. In fact, his message is good news and should inspire all of us, including practitioners of the dismal science, namely economics, to recognize that, as he said, there's no contradiction between driving growth and climate change. In fact, he offers a ringing endorsement of the importance of hope and action amid much denial. To further explain why we have selected him to be today's awardee, I would like to briefly share with you my own perspectives about why Professor Stern's research and policy work is so fundamentally important for us to learn from and act on urgently. Over my own career, I have used economic analysis to try to enhance retirement security in an aging world and to devise solutions to the problems created when people ignore the consequences of decisions made today for future generations. There's a common theme there. In a sense, elements of the groundbreaking Stern Review sounded painfully familiar when I read it, as I had made some similar recommendations when our group wrote the 2001 report of the Commission to Strengthen Social Security for then President George W. Bush. Couple of points in common. Our 2001 report noted that due to anticipated longevity increases, it was critical to move quickly to make public and private retirement provisions against the very real possibility that we might live to 120 years of age or even later. We predicted that this could wreak mayhem on old age institutions and on which the older population rely. Similarly, the Stern Review concluded that the scientific evidence implied that there are increasing risks of serious, irreversible impacts from climate change associated with business as usual paths. A second similarity, in 2001, we foresaw 2 decades of runway during which we had the opportunity to reform pensions and Social Security with far less disruption than would result from waiting. Likewise, the Stern Review concluded that, quote, the benefits of a strong early action on climate change outweigh the costs. You see the same theme. In 2001, we argued that the cost of shoring up Social Security would be significant but manageable if we acted soon. The Stern Review estimated that the annual costs of CO2 stabilization would be around 1% of GDP by 2050 if we acted quickly, a level that is significant but manageable. And finally, both of our reports agreed that future generations would be even more strongly affected than those of us living today, Yet those future generations are typically not represented when we take present day actions and make decisions. So some strong parallels indeed. And though in the US, Social Security reforms have not yet been enacted, I do know that our work continues to inform policymakers as the debate about fixing our retirement system once again emerges, with the now projected date of trust fund exhaustion of 2032. It looks a lot like the numbers that you had. But lest I sound too pessimistic in this comparison, I must hasten to point out that Professor Stern and his team focus on a much bigger problem, namely the grave global consequences of the climate issues we face now and in the future. And these are consequences that could even lead to the extinction of the human race. Serious indeed. So for this reason, I applaud his unflagging efforts to urge action as an economist, policy advisor, and humanitarian. In fact, in a recent speech, he ended his remarks by appealing to our consciences by saying, quote, "Are we going to look our grandchildren in the eye, tell them we understood the dangers and the opportunities, and yet we still failed to act? Surely not." This is his existential message and his rallying call. Let me turn now to the awarding of the Carnot Prize, named in honor of the French scientist Sadi Carnot, the father of thermodynamics. Carnot recognized the power of the steam engine and the reality that it would produce a great revolution in human development. Indeed, it continues to do so. The Carnot Prize honors those harnessing the power of energy to produce new revolutions in progress and prosperity. This prize is given to those who make distinguished contributions to energy policy, and it has become the most notable recognition of energy policy impact by leaders around the world and across all sectors. So I am doubly delighted that our awardee today is the first academic to have earned the prize, and that the University of Pennsylvania has selected him for our highest energy honor. Therefore, I'll ask you to come up if you don't mind. So for your distinguished contributions to understanding and advising the world on energy policy, it is my privilege to present on behalf of the University of Pennsylvania and the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, the 2022 Carnot Prize to Lord Nicholas Stern. I think we have pictures. A little bit more this way.
So, Mark, Frank, Olivia, Scott, thank you so much for the kind words and the great honor. And thank you to all involved in making this such a special day for me. The honor lies in, or arises from many ingredients, if you like. There's the distinction of the predecessors in this prize, women and men that have done tremendous things for the world around energy policy. There's the University of Pennsylvania, which I'm sure you recognize is extraordinarily distinguished on the global stage. There's this very special Kleinman Center here, which is a world leader established itself in a very short space of time. And of course, university associated with Benjamin Franklin is unbelievably special. So this is a great honor. And carrying the name of Sadi Carnot is, again, something very special. And I couldn't help linking Sadi Carnot with Joseph Fourier. And, you know, both people associated with the École Polytechnique in Paris, people who worked as engineers, mathematicians, physicists. And what they did, although, you know, Fourier was nearly 30 years older than Carnot, they died at a similar time. Carnot died young. But it was in 1822 that Fourier produced the analytical theory of heat. And 2 years later, Fourier gave what was essentially an extraordinarily prescient view of climate change, global warming. He did a heat balance, Fourier, and worked out that where the Earth was and its size and its distance from the sun, it ought to be a lot colder than it was. So he concluded that something was trapping the escaping of the heat and speculated as to what it could be, didn't know, but the atmosphere was one possibility. By the middle of the 19th century, Tyndall, the Irish scientist, had worked out what it was, including carbon dioxide. And by the end of the 19th century, the Swedish chemist, physicist Arrhenius had worked out, roughly speaking, sort of back of the envelope stuff, roughly how much temperature would go up if we doubled the concentrations of greenhouse gases. I mean, brilliant science through the 19th century, but it followed from Fourier. And Fourier was writing almost exactly the same time as Carnot. You know, Carnot wrote his, as Olivia said, you know, reflections on the motive power of fire, and that was published 2 years after Fourier's analytical theory of heat. It was extraordinary how these two people were writing at the same time. One of them showing what you could do with the steam engine and burning the coal to get the thing, and the other one saying, actually, this is what's happening in the climate. And it wasn't very long before those two things were linked. So this is a big history of the relationship between energy and climate. It's 200 years old. It's not something that somebody invented yesterday, and our understanding of it has got deeper and deeper over time. So what I want to do is to, I won't take too long, but I'll stay at a fairly high level, not get into too much detail. But what I wanted to do was to say, to link directly as these, on the back of that history, link directly the climate and energy policy. So I want to say, how do we think about energy policy, given what we now understand about the climate? So obviously, the Stern Review was the beginning of organizing my thoughts on that. And I basically, in retrospect, understated the case for action, even though there's a lot of argument, as Frank pointed out, that I'd overstated the case. I actually understated it. The science is much more worrying than we thought then. We now have the Assessment Review 6 from the IPCC. Then we only had number 3. And each time it's looked more worrying than before, as things come through faster and more severely. So looking back, I understated the case, but what I wanted to do is share with you how I've come to see the dynamics of change and how we can create something that looks a lot better than the dirty, destructive paths that we've followed before. So building on that story, we're thinking much more about the dynamics, much more directly about the different ways of doing things. And that's how I've come to think of energy policy, climate policy, development policy, all wrapped up together. So let's start with the risk. As Olivia Frank emphasized, this is for many people potentially existential. At the moment, we're headed for something like 3 degrees or more. If we implement some of the promises at Glasgow with some strenuousness, then it could be a bit less than that. But 3 degrees we haven't seen for 3 million years. 3 million. Homo sapiens is what, maybe 250,000, 300,000 years old. No, multiply that by 10, 3 million. We haven't seen 3 degrees in that time. We haven't seen 4 degrees for tens of millions of years, and that's a risk too. Sea level was 10 to 20 meters higher than now. I mean, think of all the coastal cities in the world and what that would do to them. And it's not just the sea level rise, it's the storm surges and the extreme weather events that come with that whole story. Some parts of the world, of course, subject to desertification. What does it mean? It means that hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of people would have to move at 3 degrees. Obviously, still more devastating at more than that. And the ones that didn't move, many of those would perish, right? So what we're talking about is a transformation of lives and livelihoods around the world, where we could live, how many of us could live, and so on. So it's very important to be clear about the stakes that we're playing for. It's also very important to be clear about the urgency of action. Now, some of those more devastating things happen down the road, but their causes are now. And this decade is absolutely decisive. So we have to do what academics are not necessarily very good at, which is we have to do our research and give policy advice at the same time. Now, if you're in a treasury, and I've been in a treasury, the finance minister will look you in the eye and say, given what you now think you know, what do you now suggest we do? And that's a fair question. We have to be able to respond to that. And at the same time, we have to think through quite difficult things. And that's the challenge of energy policy, climate policy. You've got to do both at the same time. This is a sprint, a middle distance, and a marathon. It's all three, and we've got to be good at all three. So the immensity of the risk and the urgency of the action is where we should start. And Joe Stiglitz and I have just published a paper in the Journal of Economic Methodology saying that one way of thinking about risks on this scale is not to maximize expected utility in models that have only modest perturbations, because that's not the challenge that we face. But think about how much danger are we ready to take on, or given the kinds of things that we can do. So it's a consequentialist analysis, but it's not narrow cost benefit. It's a consequentialist analysis and asking how big are these risks, how much can we reduce them, and how do we do it? What does it look like when we do it in terms of the kind of societies, economies we're going to create? And so we suggested that you should adopt a guardrail approach in those circumstances, like we do with roping off dangerous cliffs, like we do with the amount of certain kind of substance there can be in the food that we eat or the air that we breathe, like the ways in which we designate properties of seat belts in cars. We're quite used actually to the idea of guardrails. And what Joe and I suggested is that that's the way we should look at it. And lo and behold, that's the way in which the world has been looking at it. And the Paris Agreement was holding temperatures well below 2 degrees, best efforts at 1.5. In Glasgow in November last year, we started to look much more focused on 1.5 because we understood that the difference between 1.5 and 2 was really very big in terms of consequences, frequency of lethal heat waves and so on. So the world actually, without looking deep into the economic analysis, but coming at it in a sort of sensible way, did adopt that guardrail approach. And one important aspect of research for us is to try to look more deeply into the logic and the modeling of thinking about guardrails. But that's where the world's got to. It makes sense to us. So then the question is, how do you do it? Well, if you want to stabilize temperatures, you've got to stabilize concentrations, and that means net zero, right? The flows have to be net zero. If you're stabilizing the concentrations, you have to stabilize the concentrations to stabilize the temperature. If, God forbid, we stabilized at 3 degrees, it would still be net zero. And roughly speaking, the earlier we go to net zero, the lower the temperature which we stabilize. So that's really why net zero has got so strongly into the language, and it's very important. When we did the Stern Review, that time, we were thinking of not understanding sufficiently strongly the degree of risk. As I've already argued, it was even worse than we thought. And people were talking about, the scientists were telling us, that we should be thinking of, for a reasonable chance of maybe 2 degrees or thereabouts, of cutting emissions between 1990 and 2050 by 80%. Well, that was a bit mysterious. I gave you the intuition behind net zero. It's instant, it's obvious. But the intuition behind cutting by 80% 1990 to 2050 wasn't very clear, and it was sort of pulled out of models which people couldn't readily get their hands around if they weren't climate scientists. And it's remarkable when you say we'll cut emissions by 80% 1990 to 2050, how many people thought they were in the 20% that didn't have to do anything? Now, net zero actually cuts right through that. We can all do net zero. We should all do net zero. The negatives are going to be hard. We're going to have to find them. But basically, if you want net zero in aggregate, you're going to have net zero. You're going to have at least net zero practically everywhere. And that clarity has transformed the debate. And so cities, firms, countries have been declared, understanding it, because it's clear, understanding the reasons, and declaring the net zero. And that's been a big advance, and something that was manifested very strongly in COP26 in Glasgow in November. So we know what we have to do in terms of emissions. It's not just net zero by 2050, of course, it's the whole path that gets you there, because it's the sum total or the integral of emissions that counts, as Frank made very clear. So we know we're starting to get at this in a kind of engineering way. What is it? What are the properties of the thing you're going to produce? How do you design something that gives those properties? And that's where the economics should now focus. We are going to have to transform the way we use energy, how much energy we use, how it's produced, the way we use it, right across the whole economy. And in the big systems of energy, transport, cities, and land. So we have to change the way we're going to do things. So one way of starting, and I think it's a valuable way of starting, is to look at those systems and say, how can we change them in the time scale that we have to bring down, to bring it all down to net zero. And of course, we have to think about how those 4 systems interact. But that's the kind of modeling that we should be doing. It's not a general equilibrium model with a fairly fixed structure that has dominated so much of economics. It's about changing structures. It's about dislocation. It's about disequilibrium, and it's doing that change in real time. And what I'm arguing now, and what others, I'm not alone in this, I hope, is that the right way to push forward with the economics of how we get to where we need to go is by bringing our economics to those particular systems and asking how we get those changes. What kind of incentive structures, what kind of institutional relationships do we need to build to generate the confidence in the investment that we need to make? So it becomes an investment story where that investment has a purpose, the investment has the purpose of change, and at the same time, advancing living standards as we do it. And that actually is very different from the way in which a lot of economics has framed this question, built on the back of the integrated assessment models, which are essentially models with an underlying growth story. But if we don't tackle climate change, we completely disrupt that. And they're models of equilibrium, and they're models where we know it's structural change and disequilibrium, and they're models with, on the whole, diminishing, with rising marginal costs of action, when we know actually we're seeing lots of falling marginal costs of action through increasing returns. So there's a whole litany of ways in which they misplace the question which we have to ask. But I'm not pessimistic about the economics, because I think the task that I've described is eminently tractable with the kinds of tools that we have. Not totally, because we're going to learn a lot along the way. So it's not that economics hasn't got the tools, it's really just hasn't brought the right tools to the table, and it's tried to shoehorn the problem into something which is a small perturbation in underlying growth. And that was the way Bill Nordhaus, he's a fine person and a scholar and a gentleman, but Bill started 30 years ago now by saying, well, this is going to perturb growth, there's an underlying growth, there's a bit of perturbation here, and how do we manage that perturbation? That's not the problem. This is now a problem with the risks are immense, where we have to change very quickly. It's a problem of structural change in real time. So what does economics have to do? Well, it has to look at extreme risk, which I've touched on. It has to look at structural change. It has to make time of the essence, and it has to think about discounting. Frank gave up. I'm not going to go back over what Frank said, but I will just say a word or two about how I've come to think about discounting. I now don't go to the discount rate. I start with the discount factor. The discount factor is the relative value of a bit of, call it consumption down the track, and a bit of consumption now. That's the discount factor. That's the relative price. That's the relative weight. That's the way we do economics. We think about relative valuations of two different things. The discount rate is the proportional rate of fall of the discount factor, but the logically prior concept is that relative valuation of stuff coming later and stuff now. And as soon as you express it that way, the big issue which Frank brought out, but as soon as you express it that way, it's clear that the relative standard of living in the future relative to now is at the heart of the story. And we know that our inaction today has a grave danger of making future generations much poorer. So it tells you that you can't, as it were, look elsewhere and import a discount factor or discount rates. You've got to build them into the model. And as Frank emphasized that very clearly, you've got to ask, where will the consumption be relative to now? And of course, on top of that, you've got to ask the question, how do you value a life in the future relative to a life now? And I hope the answer to that question would be the same. We don't discriminate by date of birth in voting. We don't discriminate by date of birth, at least for adults, in front of courts of law. You know, why would you discriminate in terms of social valuation, people on the basis of date of birth? You need an argument to do that discrimination, and basically there isn't one other than the possibility of a meteor striking the earth, so that those people don't exist for some completely exogenous reason. So I think we've come to see that, at least I hope so, in a much better way. So that's the way we should look about the economics. What about collaboration? Because this is truly a global problem, a global issue. Economics has tended to focus on, and it's not an empty thing, but it's been too dominant in my view, on the free rider problem. That what we have is a bunch of people populating this earth. Each individual cares only about herself or himself, doesn't care about anybody else. So if this action that's called for costs something, then the individual will try and duck out of it and let somebody else do it. It's the so-called free rider problem. I think that's a much too pessimistic view of human beings. And I think we're seeing that manifesting in the way in which people have come together in communities and elsewhere. I'm not saying that the world is populated by people who are totally altruistic. You know, I've lived long enough to know that's not true either. But I do think that the very narrow model of people operating from a very sort of tight perspective of their own self-interest and free riding on everybody else isn't actually a sound model either. And we've seen people come together, we've seen people recognize that common responsibility. And so the collaboration part of it, we shouldn't be too pessimistic about, but we've got to work on how to build that collaboration. And it's ideas and the way we understand the problem, what we have to do in universities, which is a big part of that story of understanding how we motivate and encourage the kind of collaboration that is needed. We've made some progress, but obviously we're all moving much too slow. A second part of the story is a recognition of this new growth story. You know, we can really have cities where you can move and breathe and be productive. We can have ecosystems which are robust and fruitful. Sounds like a good idea, even if you've never heard of climate change. And those are the kind of benefits which we can draw from a very different way of doing things. And of course, as soon as we start to put all these things together, we recognize the kind of problems we have to solve or overcome from the point of view of making policy. We have to, it's not just the externality associated with greenhouse gases, we've got to promote research and development, we've got to build networks of public transport, we've got to reform capital markets, which are not handling the risk all that well, we've got to get information to people, we have to, you want to know what's in the product that you're buying. And of course, we have to think about the problems of air pollution and so on, which come with the immediate problems, which come with climate change. So come with burning fossil fuels. So there's a whole way now of looking at this as a tremendously attractive growth story, if we get it right, of recognizing the kind of market failures that we have to overcome, but seeing it centrally as a problem of investment and how we drive that investment. And there, I think, and I would fully agree with what Frank said on this one, is that seeing it centrally as a problem of investment to produce a different form, much more attractive form of growth and development, moves the private sector to center stage, because their majority of investment is private sector investment, the big majority. So the question is how you bring energy policy, public policy to center stage so the kind of investment which we know we need can arise. And it's major investment. The attractive story I've tried to tell doesn't come by accident. It doesn't come for free. It comes from investing and investing much more strongly and differently than we have done in the past. And that's what we can do. So I think that I don't want to leave it, but I can't dwell on it without mentioning something about the war in Ukraine and what we've seen from these terrible events. Of course, first and foremost, it's the people who suffer, but you're also seeing a rediscovery of energy security. Every now and again, we rediscover those who lived through the 70s, remember the issues around energy security very clearly. But for me and for many others, that means going faster and further away from the fossil fuels, which are causing the energy insecurity. We might have to muddle through for the next 2 or 3 years, just get by. But in terms of the medium term, the next 4, 5, 6 year strategies, we have to go harder and faster and down the route away from fossil fuels. But let me try to end on a optimistic note. By following the kind of investment and strategies I've tried to describe, by bringing the right policies to bear, we can have a sustainable, resilient, inclusive growth story for the 21st century, much more attractive than the dirty, destructive ones that went before. So I'm really enormously optimistic about what we can do. I worry greatly about what we will do. But it's our job as people who work on climate policy, economic policy, energy policy, to set out what we can do, why we must do it, what's involved, what the benefits that flow from it are. That's part of the discussion, that what we can do, and being optimistic about what we can do, is logically prior to what we will do. And we have to be involved in the political economy discussion of what we will do as well. But I think as scholars particularly, we have a duty to show what is possible, why it matters and why it's attractive. So it's in that spirit that I say thank you again for this very special prize, this very special place with a very special name. Thank you, thank you.
What a privilege. You are a very lucky room full of people who are going to remember this talk for the rest of your lives, I think. That was really quite wonderful. You know, each of the Carnot Prize winners have a characteristic in common. a kind of a courage that's particular to each of them. And it's completely fitting that this year's recipient has demonstrated an intellectual courage in his decades of work on ringing the alarm on climate change. It's important to recognize, as I think we now all do because he's such a good communicator, that he today is challenging some of the most sacred cows grazing in some of the most tightly fenced pastures in the academy, taking on fundamental ideas and staking out courageous insights that delivers economic analysis in the service of goals defined by climate scientists, right? Is becoming a team player among a whole set of disciplines that are necessary to deal with this challenge. And that is a courageous act for a famous, prestigious economist. And that, I think more than anything else, defines Nicholas Stern's special quality and his deserts for the Carnot Prize. So thank you again very, very much. That's such a privilege. So we demonstrated our own risk aversion and calculated a short-term discount rate of 0 on how bad the wind storm is going to be in a few minutes. And so here's the plan. We're the reception in the recipient's honor, and for all of you to enjoy, is going to be downstairs. We've brought the food service in so it doesn't blow away and you have an opportunity to acquire some of it. But if you would like to take your mask off, please take it outside to the tent where heaters have been installed. And let me, on the subject of heaters, let me just say, thank you very much for the Weissman School's facilities team led by Carl Wellman, who turned this room around 3 times, I think, today. And they're just amazing. And so thank you, Carl and team. But the tent is heated, so you can eat out there and take your mask off. Or you can eat inside, but please try to keep your mask on except when actually chewing. All right, thank you very much. Thank you all. We'll see you again next year. It's so great to be back in the room with you all. I hope next year brings the same. Thank you. Bye. That was a brilliant, so much. I appreciate both